On September 11th, 2001, we all watched the unimaginable happen. For the first time ever on U.S. soil, we witnessed airliners hijacked by terrorists bring down the Twin Towers in New York City. Thousands of lives lost.
At the same time, another plot unfolded in Arlington, Virginia. A plane brought down into the Pentagon. Heroes on another flight would then overpower the terrorists on board, only to tragically crash in a field in Pennsylvania. The people on those flights met with unimaginable horror. As for the rest of the country, all we could do was watch.
But the survivors of those attacks rose from the rubble and ash, inspiring a nation. Never forget, a mantra that echoed from coast to coast, no matter what city they were from. Though some degree of separation, we all found connections to that day and place.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us for this special September 11th presentation. Over the next half hour, we'll not only look back at that tragic and historic day, we'll also give you the stories of people here in Arizona directly impacted by the attacks, and even some of those who were involved. But first, we want to honor some of the heroes of that horrific day. We spoke with one firefighter who was at the Twin Towers amid the rubble, trying to pull people to safety on that Tuesday morning 20 years ago. He lost many friends and colleagues on 9/11. It's a day that's never far from his mind. News 4 Tucson's Eric Fink has his story.
We were just doing a job. We were just going there to fight a fire. And 20 years later, we walked away.
Former FDNY firefighter Dan Rowan was off that Tuesday morning.
It was simply gorgeous out. It was probably one of the better days in September. And the kicker was, I wasn't supposed to be working.
He and his colleagues raced to the towers. He'll never forget arriving on scene.
It was like a Twilight Zone movie. No one was really yelling and screaming, but there was a lot of debris in the air, and it was still just coming down.
Rowan lost hundreds of friends and colleagues.
We split up, and half went to the south, half goes to the north. So we lost 411 first responders that day. Port Authority Police, NYPD, EMS, of course 343 FDNY. Everything was just floating in the air. You had a sunny day, but it was pitch black dark in a way of the debris from the building.
Photos of his close friends who perished are never far from his reach.
Bobby King, he wasn't even supposed to be there. He was on his way home, but he hopped on engine 33 and never came home.
This piece of history is a piece of steel from one of the towers. It means so much for Rowan to see it and touch it. For this retired firefighter, it brings back all the emotion of that day 2 decades ago.
I'm happy to see the world is still there for us. Like, just touch this. This was donated. I don't know by who, but this is a piece of the Trade Center. This was on people. It came down and crushed so many people. It killed us.
This proud first responder says sometimes the mental and emotional weight of 9/11 gets the better of him, especially when he thinks about the loving memory
Leo Leppi,
of all of his friends who never made it out.
It's super tough being here without you, but you're always in my memory, always in my heart. You always rode with me. I dream of you guys all the time. So, God bless you. I'll see you soon enough.
Rowan spent 37 years as a first responder, going from the FDNY to the LAPD to wildland firefighting. Most recently, he was a police officer here in Marana. He retired in March. He says Arizona gave him a new lease on life. He says his police car here was always filled with his old fire gear. In Marana, I'm Eric Fink, News 4 Tucson.
The 9/11 attacks had an impact on so many people. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives. The entire country came together to do what they could to help the victims and their families. Daniel McFarland has a story about how a former Tucson police officer remembers his fallen friend who died that day.
Brian McDonnell graduated from the Tucson Police Academy in 1990, and he transferred from the New York Police Department. He patrolled our streets and kept the city safe. He then returned to his native New York to become part of an elite unit, the Emergency Service Unit.
He was with 5 other emergency service officers on the 14th floor in the South Tower when the building collapsed, and they were all killed.
John Sines retired in 2008 from the Tucson Police Department. He spent nearly 30 years there and will always remember 9/11.
It was the greatest loss of life in law enforcement history on one single day, and especially for the firefighters.
Nearly 3 weeks after the attacks, he, along with others from Tucson's crisis unit, went to Ground Zero. He was there as a police chaplain. On their way to the hotel, he saw hundreds of placards with pictures of people who were missing. They got to their hotel, and right in front, he sees this, Brian McDonnell's picture. He called McDonnell's wife.
She was very surprised that somebody from the Tucson Police Department would be calling her.
Sines says she was hopeful that her husband would be found in some hospital. Fast forward 20 years later, Maggie McDonnell says that her husband was fulfilling his dream of becoming a police officer.
He loved what he did. He loved working in Manhattan. So I believe that his dream was the dream of most cops. He wanted to do the right thing by people. He wanted to help people.
His widow says her husband was a cop's cop, and no truer words were ever spoken, as he was born during National Police Week, when officers are honored who have died in the line of duty.
We all remember where we were on September 11th, 2001. Hundreds of first responders selflessly jumped into action to try and save lives, and one among them now serves southern Arizona. 20 years later, we sat down with Tucson Fire Chief Chuck Ryan as he looks back on the moment he was called to respond to the attack at the Pentagon.
September 11th, 2001, it was a truly beautiful early autumn day in the Mid-Atlantic, and just, started out as just another day, another ordinary day, and for me as a lieutenant in Fairfax County Fire and Rescue.
That ordinary day quickly turned to a horrific tragedy.
What?
I think it was one of those things that was so out of the realm of normal experience, and the newscasters were unsure of what type of plane it was. 17 minutes later, the second aircraft struck the second tower, and that was captured on live television, that was clearly intentional. Yeah, you just knew it was, at that point, we were under attack.
Both towers are now.
Tucson Fire Chief Chuck Ryan says he was a couple hours into his shift in Fairfax County, Virginia, when the planes hit the Twin Towers. He says shortly after the second plane struck the World Trade Center, he and his crew were dispatched to a medical call at a local church.
She was by herself in this fairly large church with the pastor, and she had been watching the news, and she was so emotionally struck by what occurred, she started to have a panic reaction, chest pains, and instead of calling 911 from her home, went to her church to pray.
Chief Ryan says in the middle of helping that woman, they suddenly got the call to go to the Pentagon.
Pentagon just got hit. Don't say that.
It was so surreal, and that's how I described the entire day to people. It was surreal. Hard to imagine it was happening, and I just, as a company officer, thought about the safety of our crew. What knowing the proximity that we had to the Pentagon, I kind of half expected we would wind up there, and like a scene out of a war zone. It was the amount of damage just on that first outer ring was staggering.
Chief Ryan didn't lose any firefighters that day, but he did experience 2 deaths that touched him personally. 2 friends who worked for the New York City Fire Department. Deputy Chief Ray Downey, FDNY Special Operations Command, and Captain Brian Hickey, FDNY Rescue Company 4. We asked what he would say to them if they were with us now.
I would say thank you for your service. Thank you for upholding your oath. Thank you for not abandoning people who needed you at their worst hour. and thanks for your sacrifice.
Chief Ryan says 9/11 brought the country together, and he hopes Americans will band together once again in a time of so much uncertainty. But he says the best thing we can do now is continue to tell the story of a day that changed America forever.
Never forget. Don't let this history be erased or explained away, because there is no explaining it away other than it was an attack on our way of life. We can't ignore or forget about or rewrite history.
More than 180 people were killed in the Pentagon attack, and a total of 412 first responders were lost in the 9/11 terror attacks on that day.
Tomorrow marks 20 years since September 11th terror attacks. As the world was coming to grips with the tragedy that fateful day, authorities began to uncover how deep the terrorist ties were to our own community. News 4 Tucson's Lupita Murillo has the names of some key players responsible for the attacks that changed our country forever.
It's been written by the author of Jihad that Tucson had become one of the first al-Qaeda cells in the U.S. That movement took place in the 80s and early 90s. Some of what you're about to hear was never talked about or reported until now. Hani Hanjour is the hijacker who flew one of the planes in the Pentagon that killed 64 passengers on board and an additional 125 people. He attended the University of Arizona in 1991. Now retired Tucson police detective Benjamin Jimenez interviewed Hanjour as a possible lead in a separate case 11 years before the attack.
Because there was a murder that occurred in 1990 in Tucson at one of the local mosques in town here by the university, where the imam, Rashad Khalifa, was murdered.
On September 11, 2001, the FBI interviewed Jimenez and Detective Karen Wright, who had worked the Khalifa murder 11 years before.
We found out that it was Hanjour that flew the plane into the Pentagon, that bells kind of rang, and oh yes, we did speak to him. He was young, he was 18, maybe back in 1990. He said he was a student. We were all shocked in a lot of ways that this had happened, and that we had a suspect that actually was here in town.
Hanjour also lived in Mesa and took flight training in Scottsdale. He was killed in the attack. According to the 9/11 Commission report, he wasn't the only tie to the 9/11 attacks. Mubarak al-Duri was a native of Iraq. He lived in Tucson in the late 1980s and, according to investigators, obtained weapons of mass destruction for Osama bin Laden. He's now reported to be in hiding in the Middle East. Wadi al-Hajj was believed to be Osama bin Laden's top aide and personal assistant. He worked for the city of Tucson for 6 months in 1988. In 1993, he reportedly bought a T-39 aircraft from a businessman who purchased a fleet of them from the boneyard at Davis-Monthan. Investigators say he retrofitted that plane in a Tucson hangar, flew it to Sudan, and handed the keys to Osama bin Laden. In 1998, he was convicted of the bombings of the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. He's serving a life sentence in a supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. Jimenez and Wright weren't the only TPD officers interviewed by federal agents. A year after the 9/11 attack,
13 years after my initial investigation, I received a call from an ATF agent and an FBI agent.
At the time, Marana Police Chief Ruben Nunez was a detective who worked and solved a missing persons cold case. The federal agents were interested in the people he came across and questioned during his investigation.
We actually identified a network of Middle Eastern males that were working together selling counterfeit products, and then the funding sources were going back to the Middle East.
Nunez says this network was also into weapons. Agents tracked the organization to the East Coast. They uncovered the money made was sent back to the Middle East to support terrorist activities.
Looking back and seeing some of the things that occurred, I think it was for a reason. I think some of those individuals had a purpose.
Lupita Murillo, News 4 Tucson.
For the past 10 years, the Tower Challenge has been honoring those lost on 9/11 right here in Tucson. Participants climbed 2,071 steps to mirror the height of the former World Trade Center towers.
What started with 125 people 10 years ago has grown to thousands. News 4 Tucson's Mark Mangura tells us what it means to those who climb every year.
Normally at the University of Arizona, this year the Tower Challenge will be here at the Tucson Convention Center. And on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, this challenge has continued to grow, ensuring that those lost on that day will never be forgotten. The first edition of the Tower Challenge in Tucson started back in 2011, on the 10th anniversary of the attacks. It began with a small group of first responders. Now, it's grown to thousands.
Our whole mission is never to forget September 11th. We recognize that there were so many sacrifices made that day, and there continues to be a lot of sacrifice.
As interest grew, the Tower Challenge was quickly moved from a downtown building to the University of Arizona football stadium to accommodate the turnout. On the 20th anniversary of a day that shook the nation, first responders still feel that pain as if no time has passed.
The innocent people that died that day, the acts of heroism, you know, we all say never forget, but it's always remember. I think that's a good way of looking at it, always remember.
It's an emotional experience for many. Baker admits to feeling a connection to those who have left us. But this event helps us to remember them, and that's what he feels is important. In the 10th year of this event, the impact it has on the community continues to grow across Arizona.
September 11th was a tough day for all of us, but as a nation we came together and we worked hard and we rebuilt and we showed each other kindness and love and we helped each other, and that spirit is what we accomplished by doing this event.
As a first responder, this date carries a special significance for Baker and others in his shoes. Those that lost their lives trying to save others did it without hesitation, because it's a first responder's job to put others' safety above their own.
Again, it's, could I do that? And I think everyone that is there asks that question of themselves. Could we do that if we were called upon? And as a first responder, the answer has to be yes.
Until that call is made, he'll honor them the best way he can, one step at a time. If you want to participate tomorrow but can't make the event in person, there's a virtual option that you can find more information about on our website, KVOA.com. From the Tucson Convention Center, I'm Mark Magura, News 4 Tucson.
The 9/11 Commission report details the terrorist attacks and how counterterrorism investigations have evolved in law enforcement. A common phrase heard after the attacks, connecting the dots.
Clearly, the dots were there, but they were not connected. And so there were fixes put in place almost immediately by the Bush administration to ensure that those dots would always be connected.
Frank FIGLIUZZI, a former FBI assistant and director of counterintelligence and NBC contributor, was assigned to the Miami office. He says 9/11 was a wake-up call for the intelligence community.
I'm pleased to say that the fixes put in place, the sharing and dissemination of intelligence, the intelligence collection mechanisms are light years ahead of where they were on 9/11.
David Gonzalez, now the U.S. Marshal for Arizona, was a commander with the Arizona Department of Public Safety. He agrees the sharing of information among law enforcement has been vital.
We talk about all the issues going on in our communities on terrorism, both international terrorists, domestic terrorists, and all other major crime issues that would affect our communities.
They believe uniting the country is the way to defeat all threats to our democracy.
There's a real concern here that we're so polarized as a nation that we may lack the ability to unify against a common threat.
Being in a 20-year war in Afghanistan and with COVID and the political infighting that's going on in this country have just fractured this country to a point where we wonder what it's going to take, and we need to remember the victims of 9/11.
FIGLIUZZI adds that we should not take our freedom, safety, and security for granted. He says we all have to be part of that solution if we're going to defeat further attempts to attack us.
Just days after the 9/11 attacks, News 4 Tucson, along with other members of the community, gathered thousands of Tucsonans to create a human flag to symbolize how the community felt over this tragedy and to demonstrate what indeed makes America great. Angelique Lizardi has a look back at that day.
2 decades ago, over 15,000 Tucsonans gathered here on what is now the Keno Sports Complex to remember the lives lost on 9/11.
We were reeling just like every other
American town, and we needed to do something positive. We needed to contribute in some way.
Former KVOA News Director Lisa Contreras says with the help from multiple media outlets, she was able to gather thousands of Tucsonans wearing red, white, or blue to create a human flag just days after 9/11. Contreras says 15,000 people made the human flag, and the other 2,000 were placed in other parts of the field. Support was needed for traffic control. Fire departments were on site to keep people cool during the blistering heat. Contreras says people were patiently waiting 3 hours in line to create the flag and says she was witnessing history in the making.
People were very patient, incredibly patient. They wanted to be a part of it. They felt the need to be there. They felt the need to do something, to contribute in some way. And I just felt lucky enough to be a privileged witness.
Organizers tell News 4 Tucson that a printout of the human flag was given to former President George W. Bush. At the Keno Sports Complex, I'm Angelique Lizardi, News 4 Tucson.
It is hard to imagine 2 decades have now passed. No matter where you were or who you know, there's always a connection to that day.
For the survivors of the attack, we will continue to heal with you and help you no matter how much time has passed.
And for those who lost their lives, you will forever be remembered and carry a special place in the hearts of every American. Thank you and good night.